He stood quietly at the edge of the grand hall, mop in hand, eyes searching the crowd. The music played, lights sparkled, but his heart beat louder. When he asked to speak to the bride, her family scoffed. "You," they sneered. "Security, get this man away from our daughter." Two guards stepped forward, hands out, ready to shove him aside. Guests turned to watch, some laughing, others whispering. Just a janitor. Just a man in overalls. What could he possibly want with a woman like her? But he didn't back down. Instead, he reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside, 2 rings. 1 engagement, 1 wedding. The whispers stopped. The laughter died. Because those rings weren't new, they were hers. And then she appeared. The bride, breathless, eyes wide with recognition. "What's going on?" she asked. Her parents froze. Because the man they tried to erase from her life was the one she had already chosen. Welcome to Heroes Unheard. Before we continue this emotional story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being a part of it. The Grand Ballroom at the Riverside Hotel was the kind of venue that appeared in bridal magazines and wedding planners' portfolios, with crystal chandeliers, hand-painted murals, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked manicured gardens where photographers captured the perfect moments that would define couples' memories for decades to come. Today, it was decorated for what was being called the social event of the season, the wedding of Catherine Morrison to Jonathan Hayes III. A union that would combine 2 of the city's most prominent families in a ceremony that had cost more than most people earned in several years. Miguel Santos had been working as a maintenance supervisor at the Riverside Hotel for 3 years, ever since he had arrived in the city with nothing but a work visa, basic English skills, and the determination to build a better life for himself and eventually for a family he hoped to start. His job involved everything from repairing plumbing and electrical systems to setting up event spaces and ensuring that the hotel's facilities functioned smoothly during the elaborate celebrations that brought wealthy clients from across the region. The work was demanding and often invisible, performed during early morning hours and late evening shifts when guests weren't present to be disturbed by the noise and disruption that maintenance activities inevitably created. Miguel took pride in his craftsmanship and reliability, understanding that his reputation for quality work was his most valuable asset in a competitive job market where immigrant workers were often viewed as interchangeable rather than as individuals with unique skills and contributions. But Miguel's relationship with the Riverside Hotel went deeper than his employment, because the woman getting married in the Grand Ballroom today had once been the most important person in his life. Catherine Morrison had been Catherine Williams when they had met 2 years earlier, a graduate student working on her master's degree in social work while volunteering at the community center where Miguel taught English classes to other recent immigrants. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on shared conversations about their hopes for the future, their experiences navigating cultural differences, and their commitment to making positive contributions to the communities that had welcomed them. Catherine had been drawn to Miguel's quiet intelligence and unwavering integrity, while Miguel had fallen in love with Catherine's compassion and her genuine interest in understanding the challenges faced by people whose backgrounds were different from her own. For 18 months, they had been planning a future together that would have combined Miguel's practical skills and strong work ethic with Catherine's education and family connections to create opportunities for both of them, while building a partnership based on mutual respect and shared values. Miguel had been saving money for an engagement ring while Catherine had been introducing him gradually to her family and friends, preparing them for an announcement that would surprise some people but that felt natural and right to both of them. The relationship had ended abruptly 6 months earlier, not because their feelings for each other had changed, but because Catherine's family had discovered the seriousness of their connection and had applied pressure that Catherine had found impossible to resist. Her parents, particularly her mother, had made it clear that marriage to an immigrant maintenance worker would damage Catherine's career prospects and social standing in ways that would affect her for the rest of her life. The pressure had been applied gradually but relentlessly, through conversations about Catherine's future, introductions to appropriate young men from suitable families, and increasingly explicit discussions about the importance of making choices that would enhance rather than limit her opportunities. Catherine's family had not been overtly racist or classist in their objections to Miguel, but they had made it clear that they considered him unsuitable not because of his character but because of his circumstances. Catherine had tried to resist the pressure while also trying to convince Miguel that they could overcome the obstacles that their different backgrounds presented. But gradually, The constant stress of managing family disapproval while maintaining a relationship that required secrecy and careful navigation of social boundaries had worn down her resolve and her confidence that their love could triumph over practical considerations. The engagement to Jonathan Hayes III had been announced 3 months after Catherine had ended her relationship with Miguel. Presented to the social pages as a fairy tale romance between two people whose families had been friends for generations and whose union would combine complementary business interests with genuine affection and shared values. Miguel had learned about Catherine's engagement through a newspaper article that had appeared in the society section, complete with photographs of the happy couple and details about the upcoming wedding that would be held at the hotel where he worked. The irony had not been lost on him that he would be responsible for maintaining the facilities where the woman he loved would marry someone else. But he had needed the job and had hoped that professional obligations would help him achieve some measure of closure regarding their relationship. The weeks leading up to the wedding had been torture for Miguel, as he had watched the elaborate preparations taking place in the same spaces where he worked every day. He had seen Catherine during the venue tours and planning meetings, but they had managed to avoid direct interaction through careful scheduling and mutual understanding that conversation would be painful for both of them. Miguel had tried to convince himself that Catherine's choice was reasonable and perhaps even wise, that her family's concerns about their different backgrounds and economic prospects were based on realistic assessments of the challenges they would have faced as a couple. He had told himself that his feelings for her should not prevent him from wanting her to be happy, even if her happiness was being built on a foundation that excluded him from her life. But as the wedding day had arrived and Miguel had watched the final preparations being completed in the grand ballroom, he had found it increasingly difficult to accept that Catherine was genuinely happy with the choice she had made. During the planning meetings he had observed from a distance, she had seemed tense and withdrawn, going through the motions of wedding preparation without the joy and excitement that should have characterized such an important milestone in her life. The morning of the wedding, Miguel had arrived at work early to complete the maintenance tasks that needed to be finished before guests began arriving for the ceremony. He had been checking the sound system in the ballroom when he had overheard a conversation between Catherine and her maid of honor that had revealed the depth of Catherine's uncertainty about the marriage she was about to enter. "I keep thinking about Miguel," Catherine had said quietly, believing she was alone with her closest friend in a room where no one else could hear her doubts and fears. "You made the right choice," her maid of honor had replied with the kind of firm conviction that suggested this conversation had taken place many times before. "Miguel is a sweet guy, but Jonathan can give you the kind of life you deserve. Security, status, opportunities that you never would have had with a maintenance worker." "But I loved Miguel," Catherine had said with a sadness that had cut through Miguel's heart like a physical wound. "I still love Miguel. Jonathan is nice, but it's not the same. It doesn't feel real." Miguel had left the ballroom immediately, understanding that he had heard something private that was not intended for him, but also recognizing that Catherine was about to make a mistake that would affect the rest of her life, and possibly his as well. He had spent the rest of the morning trying to decide whether he had any right to interfere in a situation that Catherine and her family had determined was best for everyone involved. The wedding ceremony had been scheduled to begin at 4 o'clock, with guests arriving throughout the afternoon for a celebration that would continue well into the evening. Miguel had been assigned to work during the event, handling any maintenance issues that might arise and ensuring that the hotel's facilities functioned smoothly throughout the festivities. By 3:30, the ballroom was filled with 500 guests dressed in formal attire that represented more money than Miguel earned in years, talking and laughing while they waited for the ceremony to begin. Miguel had been checking the electrical systems in the adjoining rooms when he had heard the music begin and had realized that Catherine was about to walk down the aisle toward a marriage that she had privately described as feeling unreal. The decision to act had been impulsive and probably irrational, driven by love and desperation rather than by careful consideration of consequences or realistic assessment of outcomes. Miguel had walked toward the ballroom with his heart pounding, knowing that he was about to create a scene that would embarrass Catherine and her family while probably costing him his job and possibly his visa status. But he had also known that he would regret not speaking up for the rest of his life, that letting Catherine marry someone else without at least trying to remind her that other choices were possible would haunt him more than any professional or legal consequences he might face for disrupting her wedding. The ballroom doors were open, and Miguel could see Catherine walking down the aisle in a dress that cost more than his annual salary, moving toward an altar where Jonathan Hayes III waited with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his right to claim anything he wanted. The assembled guests were watching the procession with the satisfied expressions of people witnessing the confirmation of social order and appropriate relationships. Miguel had stepped into the doorway of the ballroom, still wearing his maintenance uniform and carrying the tools that marked him as someone who belonged behind the scenes rather than in the spotlight of a high-society wedding. His presence in the doorway had gone unnoticed at first, but as he had moved further into the room, guests had begun to turn and stare at the maintenance worker who was clearly out of place in their exclusive celebration. "Excuse me," Miguel had called out, his voice carrying across the ballroom despite his nervousness and the obvious inappropriateness of his interruption. The music had stopped immediately, and every head in the room had turned to stare at the man in work clothes who had just disrupted the most important social event of the year. Catherine had frozen at the altar, her face showing recognition and something that might have been relief mixed with terror. Jonathan Hayes III had stepped forward with the outraged confidence of someone whose special day was being ruined by an inappropriate intrusion. "Security!" Jonathan had called out loudly. "Get this man out of here immediately." Catherine's father, Robert Morrison, had also moved toward Miguel with obvious anger about the disruption of his daughter's wedding and the embarrassment being caused in front of their most important friends and business associates. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Morrison had demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was accustomed to having his commands obeyed immediately and without question. But Miguel had not moved toward the exit or shown any sign of backing down from the confrontation he had initiated. "I need to speak with Catherine," Miguel had said clearly, his voice carrying throughout the silent ballroom. The request had triggered laughter from some of the assembled guests, who found the idea of a maintenance worker requesting a private audience with the bride to be absurd and entertaining. "You need to leave immediately," Morrison had replied with cold finality, "before I have you arrested for trespassing and disrupting a private event." Catherine's mother had approached with the kind of fury that came from having her carefully planned social triumph threatened by someone she considered beneath notice. "How dare you show your face here?" she had said with venomous anger. "After everything we've done to protect Catherine from people like you." The phrase, "people like you," had hung in the air like a toxic cloud, reducing Miguel to nothing more than his immigration status and employment classification while ignoring the character and integrity that Catherine had fallen in love with. But Miguel had reached into his pocket and pulled out something that had made the entire ballroom fall silent with shock and confusion. The engagement ring Miguel pulled from his pocket caught the light from the crystal chandeliers and threw sparkles across the silent ballroom. A modest but beautiful symbol of promises that had been made in love and hope before family pressure and social expectations had intervened to destroy them. It was followed by a second ring, a simple gold wedding band that Miguel had purchased with money saved from months of overtime work and careful budgeting. "Catherine," Miguel said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's perfect acoustics, "you said yes when I asked you to marry me. You said yes when I told you I loved you and wanted to spend my life with you. What changed?" The question hit the assembled guests like a physical force, transforming the disruption from an inappropriate intrusion by a confused employee into something far more complex and emotionally charged. Catherine stood frozen at the altar, her face showing the conflict between the love she still felt for Miguel and the family pressure that had convinced her to choose security over passion. Jonathan Hayes III stepped forward with obvious outrage, understanding that his wedding was being revealed as Catherine's second choice rather than her fairy tale romance. "Catherine, who is this man?" Jonathan demanded, his voice carrying a note of desperation that suggested he already knew the answer would threaten everything he thought he understood about their relationship. Catherine's father moved toward Miguel with the obvious intention of having him physically removed from the premises, but Catherine's voice stopped him before he could take action. "Miguel," Catherine said softly, her voice barely audible but carrying throughout the silent ballroom, "you shouldn't be here." "I know I shouldn't be here," Miguel replied, his voice growing stronger as he spoke directly to the woman he loved rather than to the hostile crowd surrounding them. "But you shouldn't be here either. Not like this. Not marrying someone you don't love because your family convinced you that love isn't enough." He held up the rings again, and the simple gesture seemed to carry more weight than all the expensive decorations and elaborate preparations that had gone into creating the perfect wedding. "You told me that what we had was real," Miguel continued, his words addressed to Catherine but heard by everyone present. "You told me that we could build a life together based on respect and partnership and shared dreams. You told me that my background didn't matter because you loved me for who I was, not for what I could provide." The truth of his words was evident in Catherine's expression, which showed recognition and pain in equal measure. Around the ballroom, Guests were beginning to understand that they were witnessing not just a disruption but a revelation about the bride's true feelings and the circumstances that had led to her engagement to Jonathan. Catherine's mother approached Miguel with barely controlled fury, understanding that his presence threatened to expose the family's role in manipulating Catherine's romantic choices. "You have no right to be here," she said with cold anger. "Catherine made her choice, and it wasn't you. She's marrying a man who can provide for her properly, who can give her the kind of life she deserves." "What kind of life does she deserve?" Miguel asked, his question directed to Catherine's mother but intended for Catherine herself. "One where she marries someone her family approves of but doesn't love? One where she spends the rest of her life wondering what would have happened if she had followed her heart instead of your expectations?" He turned back to Catherine, ignoring the hostile crowd and focusing entirely on the woman whose happiness mattered more to him than his own dignity or future prospects. "Catherine, I came here because I heard you talking this morning. I heard you say that you still love me, that marrying Jonathan doesn't feel real. I came here because I couldn't let you make a mistake that you'll regret for the rest of your life." Catherine's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Miguel, seeing in his face the sincerity and love that had drawn her to him originally and that she had tried to convince herself she could live without. "Miguel, my family is right," Catherine said with obvious pain. "We come from different worlds. The challenges would be too difficult. You deserve someone who can love you without worrying about what other people think." "I don't want someone else," Miguel replied with simple honesty. "I want you. Not because of what your family can provide or what your social connections can offer, but because you're the person I want to build a life with. Because you're the person who makes me want to be better than I am." He stepped closer to the altar, ignoring the obvious hostility from Catherine's family and the shocked expressions of the wedding guests. "I saved money for 2 years to buy these rings," Miguel said, holding them up so Catherine could see them clearly. "Not because they're expensive or impressive, but because I wanted to give you something that represented my commitment to you. I wanted to promise you that I would work every day to build a life that would make you happy, even if that life looked different from what your family had planned for you." Jonathan Hayes III had been listening to the exchange with growing anger and humiliation, understanding that his wedding was being revealed as a consolation prize rather than a love story. "This is ridiculous," Jonathan said loudly, trying to reclaim control of the situation. "Catherine, tell this man that you've made your choice and that he needs to leave immediately." But Catherine was staring at the rings in Miguel's hands, remembering the night he had proposed to her in the community center where they had met, when she had said yes without hesitation because she had known that what they shared was real and worth fighting for. "Catherine," Miguel said quietly, extending his hand toward her, "come with me. Right now. Today. Not because I can promise you an easy life, but because I can promise you a real one. Because I can promise you a partnership built on love and respect and shared dreams rather than on family expectations and social convenience." The offer hung in the air like a challenge, forcing Catherine to choose between the security of conforming to her family's expectations and the uncertainty of following her heart toward a future that would require courage and determination, but that would be authentically hers. The ballroom was so silent that the only sound was the whisper of air conditioning and the distant noise of traffic on the street outside. 500 guests waited to see whether Catherine would choose the conventional happiness that her family had arranged or the authentic love that Miguel was offering despite the social and economic obstacles that would make their life together challenging. Catherine looked around the ballroom at the faces staring back at her, taking in the mixture of shock, disapproval, curiosity, and judgment that characterized the crowd's response to being forced to witness a moment of genuine emotional truth rather than the carefully choreographed performance they had expected to observe. She looked at Jonathan, who represented security and social approval, but who had never made her heart race or her future seem full of possibilities. She looked at her parents, whose love for her was real but whose vision of her happiness was limited by their own fears and social conditioning. And she looked at Miguel, who represented uncertainty and social complications, but who also represented the kind of authentic partnership she had dreamed of building with someone who saw her as an equal rather than as a prize to be won or a responsibility to be managed. "I'm sorry, Jonathan," Catherine said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's acoustics. "You're a good man, and you deserve someone who loves you completely. But that's not me. It's never been me." She began walking down the aisle toward Miguel, each step representing a choice to prioritize her authentic feelings over her family's expectations, to choose love over security, to choose a partnership based on mutual respect over a marriage based on social convenience. "Catherine, don't do this," her mother called out with desperate authority. "Think about your future. Think about the opportunities you're throwing away." But Catherine continued walking, her steps becoming more confident as she moved toward the man who had risked everything to remind her that other choices were possible. When she reached Miguel, he took her hands gently, his touch conveying relief, love, and gratitude that she had found the courage to follow her heart despite the pressure from everyone around her. "Are you sure?" Miguel asked quietly, giving her one final opportunity to reconsider a decision that would change both of their lives permanently. "I've never been more sure of anything," Catherine replied, her voice carrying a certainty that had been missing from her demeanor throughout the wedding preparations. Miguel slipped the engagement ring onto Catherine's finger, followed by the wedding band that represented his commitment to building a life with her based on partnership and equality rather than on traditional expectations about gender roles and family obligations. "I love you," Catherine said with tears in her eyes, speaking the words that should have been part of her wedding vows but that felt more meaningful in this moment of authentic choice than they would have in any scripted ceremony. "I love you too," Miguel replied, sealing their commitment with a kiss that was witnessed by 500 shocked guests who had expected to see a conventional wedding but had instead witnessed something far more powerful and transformative. The couple left the ballroom together, walking past guests who were too stunned to react and family members who were too angry to speak. They walked out of the hotel and into a future that would be challenging, but that would be authentically theirs, built on mutual love and respect rather than on family expectations and social conventions. The scandal of Catherine Morrison's abandoned wedding became legendary in the city's social circles, but rather than damaging her reputation permanently, it eventually enhanced it among people who valued courage and authenticity over conventional success. Catherine's decision to follow her heart inspired other people to examine their own relationships and life choices, encouraging them to prioritize genuine happiness over social approval. Miguel and Catherine were married in a simple ceremony 3 months later, attended by friends from the community center where they had met and colleagues from both of their workplaces who understood that their relationship was built on solid foundations of mutual respect and shared values. Catherine had faced some professional consequences for her dramatic wedding exit, losing opportunities with employers who valued conventional behavior over individual integrity. But she had also gained opportunities with organizations that appreciated her willingness to stand up for her principles and her demonstrated commitment to authentic relationships. Miguel had lost his job at the Riverside Hotel, but his reputation for skilled work and reliable character had helped him find better employment with a construction company that valued his expertise and promoted him to supervisory positions based on his abilities rather than his immigration status. Together, they had built a life that combined Miguel's practical skills and entrepreneurial ambitions with Catherine's education and community connections, creating opportunities for both of them while maintaining the partnership of equals that had drawn them together originally. Years later, when they told their children about the dramatic beginning of their marriage, Miguel and Catherine would emphasize the importance of making choices based on authentic feelings rather than on external expectations, of choosing partners who respected them as equals rather than as trophies or projects to be managed. They would explain that true security came not from conforming to other people's definitions of appropriate relationships, but from building partnerships based on mutual love, respect, and shared commitment to growing together through whatever challenges life presented. The wedding rings that Miguel had pulled out in the ballroom had become symbols not just of their commitment to each other, but of the courage required to choose authentic love over social convenience, to prioritize personal integrity over family pressure, to build relationships based on genuine partnership rather than on conventional expectations. Sometimes the greatest love stories begin with someone having the courage to disrupt a ceremony that looks perfect from the outside but feels empty to the people most directly involved. Miguel and Catherine's story reminds us that authentic happiness often requires choosing uncertainty over security, love over approval, and personal truth over social convention. The measure of a relationship isn't found in its social acceptability, but in the mutual respect and genuine affection that sustains it through both triumph and challenge. Because sometimes the person in work clothes carries more love in his pocket than all the expensive decorations and elaborate ceremonies can provide. And sometimes the greatest wedding gifts are the courage to choose authentically and the wisdom to prioritize what really matters. This story was brought to you by Heroes Unheard. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how you remember them. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.